like this, but we all know someone that does. I'm being a little facetious there. Statistically, we know that, particularly when it's Christian audiences, somewhere between 10 and 20% are actually struggling with this. Pastors, the latest study at pastors.com, a survey there indicated about 50% of pastors admitted to having looked at internet pornography within the last 30 days. Yes, it was actually 54. So, yeah, anytime we're in a setting that is Christian, we know this is a serious problem. And like Ann just said, it is, I believe, the #1 problem, but not being talked about enough. So, I'll start with the official part of this. Whenever you tell me you're ready to roll.
We're ready. Go.
Okay.
So wait a second. You just said 10 to 15% of the population.
Christians.
But 54% of the ministers.
Have admitted to looking. Not necessarily that they were addicted, but admit to looking. So that'll be one to talk about a little bit later.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right. Well, it's an honor to be here tonight with y'all. This is, I guess, my second or third time in this building talking about this issue in the last year, and that really speaks highly of you, because it says that as a church you all are willing to take some steps to address something that a lot of churches have yet to do, and I think you're to be commended for that, and I'm really honored to be able to join you all again. Sexual addiction in so many ways has become the Christian's drug of choice. And one of the things that as a counseling center we have made a commitment to do is to try to get good resources out there, not only for the addict, but also for the families of addicts. And so forgive me for just a moment while I do a little bit of promotional stuff, but this is a picture of a book I wrote called Sarah, and that's an acronym, stands for Spouses of Addicts, Rebuilding and Healing. And it's for the family members of people who are struggling with sexual addiction. The Life Guide for Young Men is part of a series of workbooks that was produced by Life Ministries. And these are workbooks designed for churches that want to start ministries to people who are struggling with sexual addiction in their families. And, this is one of two that I authored, the Life Guide for Young Men, and then also the latest in the series is the Life Guide for Couples. And amazingly, we find that couples in recovery, when both people do the work and take that journey together, it's amazing how well that they do. And we've seen some phenomenal results come out of some of the couples' work. But these are just a few of the resources, and there will be many others that we'll talk about this evening. This is a cartoon that I think in many ways reflects some of what we're experiencing in our culture. It says, after observing how wearing a cone helped his dog Rex curb certain distasteful habits, Jake decided it might help him with his wandering eye. Well, in our visually saturated culture, there are plenty of things for our eyes to wander to in this day and age. And to the point that people who are now studying the brain and do brain imaging are actually showing us how our culture is rewiring people's brains. With all of the visual saturation, the high stimulation, it's having an effect on us just as we go throughout our daily lives. Culturally, you cannot get away from this issue. The reality of it is, none of us were able to drive to this building tonight without being sexually invaded. It either came to you through a song on your radio or through a billboard. But I can promise you that today, something sexual has already invited itself into your world, and you didn't go looking for it. Anytime I go check into a hotel room, there's going to be an advertisement there somewhere for X-rated movies. You know, when you drive down the street, you will see it in the advertising when you turn on a television set. And so, in so many ways, that dominates our culture today. And none of us are immune from its effects. We sometimes get desensitized to it, but none of us are immune. And the reality of it is, any of us can fall at any time. And so this is a subject to be approached with humility, because none of us have risen above sexual sin or any kind of sexual acting out. And we're all human, and any one of us can be tempted. What we'll be talking about tonight is just some of the basic principles about sexual addiction, about working with addicts. And then what I want to do towards the end of this, since we're talking to you all as Stevens ministers and people who work in more of a lay counseling or peer counseling type role, is to try to make some specific applications for you and how some of these things can apply to the setting in which you serve. I also want to say, as I start, that as a professional counselor, I rely on people like you to do the part of the job that I can't do. There are things that I can do, maybe as a licensed professional, that you can't. There's a lot of things you can do that I can't. And when we have people like you in place who can come alongside the folks we're working with, it is amazing how much better they do in the long run. So I'm really grateful that you all are here. And we want to try to make some very practical applications to you as we go through this tonight. I love this quote. It's from a man named James Cassidy. He runs an addiction treatment center in Florida. And he says that in the new, and let's face it, political climate, sex addiction has come out of the closet much as alcoholism has in recent decades. For most of this century, everybody thought that the alcoholic was the bum on the park bench. In the 70s and 80s, it dawned on people that he was also the person who was having the 3 martini lunches at the private club. Now lunchtime martinis are frowned upon, but the circumstances are just right for sex addiction to flourish. Take a group of baby boomer men and women, yes women, who came of age during the sexual revolution, put them into the anxiety-producing pressure cooker of today's work environment, ratchet up the pressure to produce, take away time to nurture real family relationships, give easy access to phone sex, cyber sex, and prostitutes. Abracadabra. If a person is so inclined, he can fill his addictive need and 15 minutes later be back for a meeting with no hangover. What other addiction is like it? And so in so many ways you can see why this is the ideal addiction. Because there aren't the physical side effects, per se, that you would think of if you compared it to alcoholism. And people can act out and go right back to work. And people don't necessarily know, because they're not going to smell something on your breath, or not necessarily going to see you staggering around as though you were intoxicated or under the influence of something. For most of the 70s, this probably was our perception of an alcoholic. And then, as the quote says, we discovered it was the people wearing the 3-piece suits and the businessmen. Well, at one point, there was a belief that only men were alcoholics. People thought it wasn't women. Well, now, today, if you were to go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, you would find a large percentage of people there who struggle with alcoholism are women. And so there was another stereotype that was blown. Well, guess where we're finding most of the sex addicts that we work with today? We're finding them in the pews of our church buildings. It's not the person who's out in a trench coat flashing people. It's not necessarily a sex offender, and the sex offender is a completely different set of issues from a sex addict. I can still count on one hand in all these years the number of addicts I've worked with who are also offenders. When people get into the offending, child molestation and issues like that, we actually refer to another professional for that because it's a completely different set of issues. But the people we're talking about here today are the folks that look like you and me. Normal, middle, upper class Americans who you go to church with. People who are making great contributions to the body of Christ, making great contributions in our culture, and yet they have struggles. And so many of them are going to be Christian. This is a problem that is intergenerational. It is not something that just affects the young. Several years ago, I went to do a workshop for a church in another city, and when I got there, I found out that the elders of this particular church had been telling the men, if you will just hang on until you get in your 50s, you will outgrow this problem. Folks, we have treated this problem in nursing homes. Even as I speak, there are 2 men in our sexual addiction group who are over the age of 70. We have had one in a nursing home who was 92. We've had another one who was 88. We've had men who were kicked out of nursing homes because of their addiction. And so this